Emmanuel, thanks for joining us. Well, let's try to get some details of what they're actually talking about there. What is President Macron potentially offering President Putin to avert, as we said, this what could be an impending invasion of Ukraine?
So you'll notice what Putin just said. He said he appreciates the fact that the French president comes with, quote, a serious historical perspective. We have to understand what Putin means by that. Historical perspective means that Ukraine belongs to Russia according to the Russians, and that the French president realizes what Ukraine means to Russia. On the other hand, of course, Macron, being a Western leader, being currently the chair of the European Union, the president of the European Union, with the lack of a real leadership in Berlin since the absence of Merkel. I mean, you know, Olaf Scholz is not really a partner for Putin. So Macron is filling this void. And of course, he has to try everything to preserve an order based on rules on international law and on the respect of borders. So on the one hand, he's giving Putin the feeling that Europe understands what Ukraine means to Russia, but on the other hand, there's no way Europe can accept a unilateral redrawing of borders by Russia. What that means is that apparently what Macron is trying to negotiate is a commitment, of course, with the backing of the United States, that NATO will not add Ukraine to the military alliance, to give something to Putin. But on the other hand, make sure that Putin does not change borders in Eastern Europe.
But not Eastern Europe, but what about Ukraine? Because there was a reference that President Putin made there to southeast Ukraine, presumably that disputed Donbass region, which, based on the borders established following the breakup of the Soviet Union, does go to Ukraine. Is there some kind of suggestion that President Macron is offering some kind of Russian sovereignty in that area?
Well, it's not exactly disputed. In other words, you know, according to the Russians, it belongs to Russia.
Well, it's disputed because to everybody, to Ukraine and the West, it belongs to Ukraine.
Exactly. So does Crimea, by the way.
Right.
So Crimea has already been annexed by Russia in 2014. There have been European sanctions. So there has been a precedent already, even though in Crimea there was also a referendum. But what is unacceptable, especially for Europe, is to let Putin continue with these salami tactics and annex more parts of Ukraine. Because then, you know, don't forget that as far as he's concerned, as the way the Russians see it, Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. So were the Baltic states, which are today part of NATO. And so there is a Pandora box here. And of course, if Putin gets away with annexing parts of Ukraine beyond Crimea, believe me, the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, is looking at this very carefully, and he has his own plans for Taiwan. And this would be basically the unraveling, the dismantling of the order, the law-based order that emerged from the Second World War and from the end of the Cold War. And that, of course, is where Macron is trying to play his role, where, don't forget, until now, Putin has been talking directly to Biden over the head of the Europeans.
Well, let's talk about Biden and Europe, because so far the U.S. has seemed unwilling to give a guarantee to Putin that NATO won't one day extend to Ukraine. Some might see that as a betrayal of Ukraine. But what about in Europe? What about Macron? And, of course, you mentioned Germany. Would they be willing to make that kind of concession in order to, I guess, buy peace for the rest of Eastern Europe?
I think NATO can do fine without Ukraine being part of it. I think NATO has extended enough today over democratic regimes in Europe. I don't think NATO needs the Ukraine, and I think that we have to understand, again, I'm not trying to justify Putin, but for the Russians, this would be a red line. And it's not the first time, by the way. Already in 2008, there were talks to bring the Ukraine into NATO, and already at the time, there was a lot of tension with Russia. I think, yes, the answer is yes. I think for the West, for Germany, for the United States, for France to commit not to discuss Ukraine joining NATO, I think it's fine. As far as Ukraine remains sovereign, as far as Russia commits to stop trying to grab territory from the Ukraine, I think a compromise can be found. But for this to happen, I think Putin needs to have the feeling that there is a united Western front from the United States, from the main players in Europe, in the European Union, and with the UK. And if he feels that there is a united Western front and that the West is willing, on the one hand, as I said, to commit not to add the Ukraine to NATO, but on the other hand, to make sure that Russia does not infringe upon the sovereignty of the Ukraine. I think a compromise might be found, because the cost of war for Putin in terms of the economic cost would be very high for Russia, and it wouldn't make any sense for him to go to war.
Right. Briefly, Emmanuel, I just want to reference the cancellation of this joint U.S.-Israel military exercise next month, because the Biden administration has a lot on its plate. Of course, the Iran threat and the Ukraine, especially if this turns into a shooting war, could be a huge distraction from dealing with that issue.
As you said, the Biden administration has a lot on its plate. You have the threat in Europe from Russia. You have those negotiations with Iran. Don't forget, you also have the Asian area. You have the Chinese threat in Taiwan. So, yes, the Biden administration has a lot on its plate, and it's really being tested about its commitment, its willingness to show a firm stance vis-a-vis all those players. And I think that really the Biden administration cannot afford to show any sign of weakness, because what is being tested here, as I said before, is the post-World War II international and Western-led order.
Right, and especially, of course, after the Afghanistan, much criticized
absolutely.
Afghanistan pullout. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for joining.